Good afternoon again, everyone. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the Public Programs Producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's book talk for the Third Reich of Dreams, The Nightmares of a Nation. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you again for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able to, you will visit the museum in person to see our current and upcoming exhibitions, including Art of Freedom, the life and work of Arthur Szyk, which opened recently on December 7th, 2025. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Again, that's the Zoom Q&A box rather than the chat. Now, today we are honored to be joined by Amanda Rubin. Over the past 3 decades, Amanda Rubin has directed and produced documentaries on cultural history, music, the arts, and science. These have been featured on BBC, Channel 4, the History Channel, and Discovery Plus, among other notable channels. She is currently developing a new film, The Third Reich of Dreams, with Snowstorm Productions. This animated drama tells the story of Charlotte Beradt, a Berlin-based journalist who collected the dreams of her Jewish and non-Jewish friends and neighbors during Hitler's rise to power. Based in London, Amanda works actively to share the story and the importance of the book, The Third Reich of Dreams. In addition to working on the documentary about the book and its author, which will be released in 2027, a radio documentary for BBC4 has also been commissioned on the story of Charlotte Beradt's extraordinary and subversive dream project, with a gripping struggle of ideas between external and internal freedom, between the control of public and private space, and the nightmare when the two are no longer quite distinguishable. Thank you again for joining us. I'll now hand things over to Amanda.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon to those of you in Eastern Time, and good evening to us on this side of the Atlantic. It's really a great pleasure to have been invited to share the story of Charlotte Beradt, and I thank you all for joining me. You've seen the cover, but this is the book that a rather extraordinary story of how I found it and began working on it as a film project, and how I got to be republishing it I'm hope to be able to share with you over the next sort of 40 minutes or so. So I'm going to start about 5 years ago during COVID, when somebody sent me an article in the New Yorker called "How Dreams Change Under Authoritarianism." And we were, as you will all recall, in lockdown, our world sort of shifting in a strange ways that we'd never experienced before. President Trump was in the White House, his first term in the White House, and China was denying lab leaks, and there was fighting on the streets of New York, and we were all sort of tilting on this kind of dystopian axis, and yet life went on in some ways in a very sort of normal way. We still had to go and buy bread and milk and educate children and things. And when I read this article, which was by Murray Jichow, an Australian writer, she had come across this book, The Third Reich of Dreams, in her library at the University of Melbourne in 2017, and been really intrigued by the title, and then by Charlotte Beradt herself, the author. And so she set out on a little journey and wrote this article. But what struck me about the book when I was able to read it, as soon as we came out of lockdown, I rushed to the Wiener Holocaust Library in London, and they had a copy, and I sort of devoured it. It's not a very long book, but was just this sense of living in an extraordinary historical moment and wondering whether Germans at the time knew they were about to live through what was to become a nightmare. Sort of how do you calibrate the world you're living in and what's about to happen and unfold over the next years? So when you're in a moment of history, history sort of told after the event. And that's what sort of struck me at that moment. Did Germans really know what they were beginning to live through? Would we recognize the same conditions if we were living them through them today? I mean, I was asking myself that 5 years ago. It's impossible to imagine then what we would be in now, and so it goes on. I'm really hoping to make the film before it's I can no longer, before it's sort of past. History passes this moment. But Charlotte's story, when I began to research it, also resonated with my own family story. So not only was there this sort of COVID framing, but there was also my own family who had escaped Europe during the late 1930s, early 40s. Well, my immediate family had, most of my family didn't survive. And they had found themselves in South Africa under apartheid system. And despite all the sort of deep loss and trauma and exile that they carried, I was always taught to believe that sort of humanism is the best part of our Jewish inheritance. And I sort of carry this torch that I had been handed really about a responsibility as a storyteller to try and counter injustice, to try and tell stories which help us to share our humanity. And as I researched Charlotte's story, I realized that's really the person she was. And so sort of telling her story has helped me to kind of gain strength in this fight, to stand up, to shape a different narrative. As a woman filmmaker, I believe it's also important that we move rich female lives from obscurity and into contributions from history. And so I really wanted to tell her story. I'm going to start with a dream, one of the dreams. There are a few dreams and which really sort of struck me and which I kind of were very cinematic, and partly why I was sort of really drawn to this book and to try to make a film about it. So here's a dream. She describes people just with one line. Usually, she says a date when she collected the dream, and then a little bit about them. She calls this. This was collected in 1933. A 30-year-old woman described as liberal, cultured, rather pampered dreams the following. I was sitting in a box at the opera, beautifully dressed, my hair done, wearing a new dress. The opera house was huge, with many, many tiers, and I was enjoying many admiring glances. They were performing my favorite opera, The Magic Flute. After the line, "That is the devil, certainly," a squad of policemen marched in and headed straight towards me, their footsteps ringing out loud and clear. They had discovered by using some kind of machine that I had thought about Hitler when I heard the word devil. I looked around at all the dressed up people in the audience, pleading for help with my eyes, but they all just stared straight ahead, mute, expressionless, with not a single face, showing even any pity. Actually, the older gentleman in the box next to mine looked kind and elegant, but when I tried to catch his eye, he spat at me. The woman, Charlotte writes in the book, came up with a symbol of psychological and bodily control, of ever-present possible surveillance at a time when she could have not have known about remote-controlled electronic devices, torture by electric shock, or an Orwellian Big Brother. She had her dream 15 years before Orwell's 1984 was even published. So let me tell you a little bit about Charlotte. She was born in 1901, as she often said, 1907. She was a very beautiful woman, but I think she wanted maybe in latter years to seem younger than she was. She was born into an very assimilated Jewish family. And then I don't know very much about her very early years. She doesn't write about and she didn't talk about it, I think, related to perhaps great trauma that she experienced, but she never talked about that either. And she was very unsentimental. But she came of age in the 1920s at a time of great great utopian vision, a socialist vision, and she really rode on that wave of communism. She joined the Communist Party. And it was a vision for a really better world. They really thought that they could achieve that. I think about her as clever, curious, daring, courageous, very beautiful in photographs, very charming. She charms her way out of prison. She charms her first husband out of prison. Well, charms the SA guards. She's very vibrant, very vivacious to the end. And she had this great commitment to social inequality. She was a model at times. There are very beautiful pictures of her. She was a driver, which would have been unusual at that time. She divorced very early in the 1930s. She wrote, she translated Charlie Chaplin's biography called Hello Europa. And she was a really prolific journalist. So she was working and writing and really sort of feels like she was that sort of proto-feminist, really writing about women's professions, writing about the new women coming through. It was a really exciting time and a sort of bohemian time, and she really was riding that wave. But in 1933, when Hitler came to power, she was banned from working because she was Jewish, because she was a journalist, and because she was a woman. And she joined the political struggle in the 1930s. She was arrested as a suspect in the Reichstag fire. Her then husband was arrested in the mass roundup of communists. She got out and she continued in the resistance. She printed and distributed pamphlets. She ran errands across the border to Czechoslovakia. And she also began to have strange dreams and to share some of those and to realize that other people were having these dreams. And here she was, banned from working. She just carried on with another project, a sort of journalist project, which was to document other people's dreams, not really knowing how she was going to use it. It was just a way to I suppose, well, she saw it as a way of kind of gathering evidence against the regime. She says that enthusiastic yes men or people who drew some advantage from the regime were not really accessible to her. She couldn't ask Nazis or people who supported the regime, but it was ordinary Germans, Jews and non-Jews. She asked a dressmaker, her neighbor, an aunt, milkman, friend, doctor, lawyer, people from all walks of life, who she could ask without it being dangerous to her. It was a very risky prospect, in a way, project. She wanted the most candid and unaffected responses. So she never told them why she was collecting. She would just say, somebody told me a dream the other day. And they might say, yes, I had a strange dream too. And that's how she collected these dreams. And she was also helped by a doctor friend of hers who could more unobtrusively ask people about their dreams. So she coded these dreams in a kind of code that she invented. She called, for Hitler, Goering, and Goebbels, she called them Uncle Hans, Uncle Gerhard, and Uncle Gustav. And she hid these sort of strange sounding family anecdotes in the books in her extensive library. And slowly she sent them out of Germany. These dreams were collected between 1933 and 39, around 300 of them. And she sent them as letters to friends abroad. She says this idea that dreams should be she had this idea that the dreams should be preserved for posterity. They might serve as evidence if the Nazi regime should ever be brought to trial, for they seem full of information about people's emotions, their feelings, their motives, while they were being turned into cogs in the totalitarian machine. What I was aiming at was a dictatorship's invasion of the most intimate part of human beings, of night and of sleep, right from the beginning. So it was about this invasion of privacy. There was nowhere that you could be alone with your thoughts. It felt like the regime had really sort of penetrated the most sacred, the most private corners of your soul. In 1939, well, in 38, she finally accepted that Kristallnacht happened and that they needed to leave. By then, she had a second husband, Martin Beradt, who was a lawyer and a writer, well, quite very well known actually. And they managed to escape to New York, where they arrived destitute. They managed to find an apartment on the Upper West Side, and there in her basement, with a little wash basin and a small, very small, cramped apartment, she set up a hairdressing salon, which they called the most literary salon ever. And it became a gathering place for fellow emigre writers and artists. Marc Chagall's wife was there. Bella had her hair dyed pink, evidently. The actress Elizabeth Bergner. I came across a quote today when I was doing some research. She used to laugh and say the wives of kosher butchers. So it was all walks, women from all walks of life were there. But it was a meeting place, a place where they sought solace, where they came together and they talked about war and the after effects of war. And she says very sort of whimsically that in the evenings they pushed the table to the side and they swept up their hair and they had a party and they laughed a lot. And it's very sort of moving, and you get this real sense of this place that she found solace in. Hannah Arendt also came into this milieu for about 20 years. She was dyeing hair, and she only got back to translating in the late 50s when she met Hannah Arendt. She was also Hannah Arendt's husband, Heinrich Blücher, had been her teacher in the Communist Party in the early 1920s, and she began an affair as well with Blücher, and Arendt knew about it, and this was a kind of strange but mutually supportive menage a trois somehow. It was only in the early 1960s that she revisited her dream records, and she was encouraged to write them into a radio broadcast, which she did, and it was broadcast in West German radio to a kind of a new generation which was beginning to look at its past and wondering what had happened in the preceding years. So this broadcast went out, and then slowly it morphed into a new project, which was the publication of a book in 1966 in German called Das Dritte. Oh, I'm not going to try. My German's terrible, even though I've been trying to learn it for a few years. Das Dritte Reich des Traum. It's thought to be one of the key texts to understanding how total domination functions. It was reprinted in 19. It was very widely reviewed, and very positively so in the States. Actually, I found lots of reviews, and in Germany, it was in 68 it was republished in English, translated into English rather, and then again in 85 in English. But then it fell out of print, and nobody knew where the rights were for about 40 years. Charlotte wrote in a letter that I also discovered recently. She said, "I'm grateful to the external circumstances that prevented me from evaluating my material earlier, before I could see it in the larger context to which it belongs." So she felt that that distance gave her a vantage point with which to really understand how these dreams are a record of people's inner lives, their felt experience under totalitarian regime, and the beginning of this change, this morphing, this distortion of the values that people have been living with. She says, as you've probably gathered from my book, I was neither a psychologist nor a physician. I was simply a person deeply shaken by the events who wanted to do something in response. She's always very modest, actually. So the book itself contains around 75 dreams, not scientific study nor psychoanalytic text. It's a collective diary, a witness account called out of the nation's shadows and into forensic light, says Mireille in her really brilliant essay, which is worth reading in the New Yorker. She called it a seismograph of history. And I can't remember where, but someone else had written that it was poetry written by citizens in their sleep, which I love all those descriptions of it. These dreams, these diaries of the night, she said, were conceived independently of their author's conscious will. They were, so to speak, dictated to them by the dictatorship. She felt they almost were controlling people to that extent. In the early 1970s, the eminent German historian Reinhard Koselleck, who wrote the afterword to the book, called it one of the most uniquely powerful and vivid dream records ever collated, a source book of astounding quality, revealing layers of insight that even a personal diary would not be able to uncover. The dreams bear witness to this encroaching terror, anticipating its eventual violent results. There is nothing else like it in Holocaust history, he said. So I've been really lucky to we republished, and I'll tell you about how we came to be republishing. But I've been given talks in the last year since last April when Princeton republished it, and it really resonates with so many different audiences, with historians, psychologists, analysts. It's in the political theory, literary and cultural theory, and but what it really wasn't, says Charlotta. She called dream interpretation in a sort of Freudian way. She called that existential nonsense. They were not disciples of Freud, not she, not Hannah Arendt. They didn't like it. But she talks, Freud himself in the interpretation of dreams says the dreamer does know what his dream means, only he doesn't know that he knows it. And for this reason, he thinks he does not know it. And to that point that, in a sense, these dreams really are telling stories, and they're telling the dreamer stories about the world they're living in, and to take note. And in this last few years that I've been really working in this area, I've really come to understand how dreams can give us meaning and direction, and write a kind of biography, or give us direction in really, really interesting ways that are worth taking note of. She talks about them as snapshots and sketches, mosaics, of people struggling struggling to express the inexpressible. They're all but waking dreams, she says. A German broadcaster who did the early broadcast with Charlotte in the early 60s wrote, she believed that in these dreams, the fears of an entire society revealed themselves, along with the silent adaptations already taking shape in the unconscious, adaptations that daylight obedience would soon demand. In them, she recognized the process she later called the remaking of human beings, this idea that actually humans were being remade in the kind of image of a totalitarian subject, and people's individuality was being kind of crushed and just sort of snuffed out. The dreamers are not here dealing with conflicts in their private lives or personal relationships. They do deal with damaged human relationships, she writes, but it's the environment that has damaged them. And that the dreams she collected reflect not just personal tragedy, but something more terrible to the human psyche: ostracism, uprooting, the interruption of the continuity of life, existential insecurity. And right across this dream collection, you have the same themes and motifs, which appear, and they really correspond with Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, where she talks about the boundaries that get erased when for totalitarianism to take hold, the boundary between truth and falsehood, between the public and private sphere, and between ruler and ruled, and the way in which people internalize what the regime is telling them and become their own sort of their own executioner. They terrorize themselves, and the dreams become part of this terror. So I was going to read you another dream. Years before Orwell's Big Brother, dreamers imagined that household objects, a lamp, a mirror, a clock, would denounce them to the authorities. This is a dream of a woman. An SA man was standing in front of the large, old-fashioned blue-tiled stove at the corner of our living room, where we always sit and talk in the evening. He opened the stove door, and it started to talk in a shrill, penetrating voice. This is a penetrating voice that appears in so many people's dreams, this sharp yell, this calling, loudspeakers, etc. It said everything we said about the regime, every joke we told. God, I thought, what is it going to say next? All my little comments about Goebbels. But at the same time, I realized that one sentence more or less wouldn't make any difference. The fact was, they knew everything we had thought and had said to people we trusted. So these motifs that appear all the time, um, um, mute, expressionless faces, a tongue, at one point, a cross-stitch cushion grows a tongue and starts berating the owner. These voices, these shrill, penetrating, barking voices, footsteps, marching, ringing footsteps of the SS, their uniforms, swastikas, capes, the Heil Hitler sign, decrees, laws, prohibitions, these repeat themselves, ovens, piles of bodies. This is all in dreams that people were having in the 30s. Some of that was their outside world coming into their dreams, obviously sort of residues of the day, but distorted into these sometimes comedic, sometimes terrifying sort of dream landscapes. And what's really powerful in this dream, in these dream records, is the way in which people began to kind of collapse on the inside, the way they capitulated, the way their desire and their need to belong meant that in their dreams they were beginning to conform, to accept what the regime was telling them, and to have this real sense of powerlessness about being able to resist it. So an eye doctor, 45 years old, in 1934 dreamt the SA were putting barbed wire into the hospital windows. I had sworn I would never allow them to bring their barbed wire into my ward, but then I did allow it, after all. I stood there like a caricature of a doctor as they knocked out the glass and turned my hospital room into a concentration camp with barbed wire. And even so, I lost my job. But I was summoned back to treat Hitler because I was the only one in the world who could. I was proud of myself for that and felt so ashamed of my pride that I started crying. This idea, this shame, this humiliation, this sense of knowing what's right and wrong, but going towards what the group is doing, what the power is, the way that the power is pulling you, this whole sort of conformity is so sort of stark and sad as you read it, and this real sense of people kind of being broken on the inside. I don't know where I put this one dream I wanted to share with you. That's a shame. Oh, here it is. Sorry. The other very potent image is the idea of with this wanting to belong and the sense of othering, the sense of being othered. So often people dream that they might look, if they're not Jewish, they might look Jewish. They walk around with their genealogy folders, carrying their genealogy to prove that they're not Jewish. And for those who are Jewish, there's a whole chapter on Jewish dreams and a sort of a deep sadness, really, that's beginning to build. But this idea of alienation and othering is, I think, I mean, it comes in up in lots of dreams, but here's one that's very moving. It's by a young woman who, in 1936, after the race laws were beginning to be passed and conditions were steadily getting worse for Jews, this young secretary, who had a Christian father and a Jewish mother, had a series of short dreams which all contain the idea of distancing herself from her mother, whom she actually loved very much. She says, I was driving into the mountains with mother. We're all going to have to live in the mountains before long, my mother said. At the time, mass deportations lay far in the future. You will, but I won't, I said, hating her and despising myself. And in another dream, she recounts, I had to flee with mother. We ran like crazy. She couldn't go on. I put her on my back and kept running. It hurt terribly having to carry her. After a long time, I realized I was undergoing this agony for a dead body. I was overcome with a horrific sense of relief. So that sense in which she could put her mother down, she could put her Jewish side down, she could try and she wanted to distance herself in a dream from being Jewish. That sort of split of personality is very is very powerful. So I actually didn't set out to publish this book, but I was researching it, and it's still available. It has been available in many languages and in German all the way up till today, but out of print in English for 40 years. And whilst I was researching, I was introduced to someone who said he had published it in the 80s and that he had the rights. He's called Robin Schochet. He lives just streets away from me in London. He'd been researching a book called Dream Sharing in the mid 80s, and he'd written to Charlotte, come across a book and said, could I publish this? And she'd said yes, and she'd handed the rights to him. So he said, I have the rights. Well, I have the rights, but I don't know where they are. I think I lost them. I've thrown them away. I don't know. And so I put the phone, well, put the Zoom, shut the Zoom off. And I thought, that's odd, surely, I don't know about publishing, but surely you don't throw rights away. You sort of file them or, do something with them, look after them. So, but months later, we came out of lockdown and I said, Robin, let's have a coffee. We're neighbors. And can you just look for those rights? They might be in your sort of garage or in your attic or in a box or in a file. And he turned up and he said, here they are. I'm not going to do anything with them, but you will. So you have them. And so Princeton republished this in 2025, which is fantastic. A new translation by the award-winning Damon Searle and a beautiful foreword by the American-Iraqi poet Dunya Mikhail, whose own story of exile and displacement from Baghdad very much mirrors Charlotte. She was also a journalist. She was also on Saddam Hussein's enemies list, and she emigrated to America in the 1990s. She says the book is a poignant, I think her foreword is beautiful, a poignant reminder that the battle for freedom is waged not only in the streets, but also in the recesses of the mind. This book made me realize that our dreams speak volumes about the world we inhabit. When the weight of oppression bears down upon us, our dreams adapt, reflecting the struggle for survival and the yearning for immediate relief. Tell me your dreams, and I will tell you the world you live in. So I don't need to tell you in America or anywhere else how relevant, in a way, that these stories, these dreams are to today's world. They speak so much to the fragility of democracy and our institutions. And Charlotte intended them as a lesson and a warning. What I take from this is a strength of her character and her resilience, and particularly in chapter 8, which she calls active doers, and where she describes that the stronger a person's moral and political resolve, the more positive and less absurd were their dreams. And she goes on to recount dreams of people who were either in the resistance or somehow found a way in their dreams to resist. So even small acts of bravery, one retired maths teacher, it's forbidden to write equations and numbers, and she writes in invisible ink on really thin paper, so it's invisible, but she still writes equations. Another middle class housewife dreams every single night without fail. I try to tear the swastika off the Nazi flag. I'm proud of myself and happy to do it, but the next day it's always firmly sewn on again. And Charlotte recounts this very long dream, which I think might be her dream, of a woman running through the streets, shouting and carrying people with her, saying, "We need to protest," over and over again. Then I awoke, she says, totally exhausted, and felt compelled to repeat a few more times in the same rhythm, "We need to protest." And this is, yes, given me courage, has really made me feel I kind of go back to this when I think about how little agency I feel I really have in the world and what's happening. And it's just to kind of stay true to myself and to protest and to speak my truth, because I think that's what Charlotte did. This is a beautiful dream from Sophie Skoll. Some of you might have heard of this, which is included in the book. And it's not a dream that was told to Charlotte, but it's so beautiful and poignant that she repeats it here. On the eve of her execution as a student resistance leader, Sophie Skoll, in 1943, sitting on her cot, told her cellmate, "It was a sunny day and I was carrying a baby in a long white dress to be baptized. The road to the church ran up a steep mountain, but I held the child tight, safe in my arms. Then suddenly a crevasse opened up right in front of me. I had just enough time to put the child down on the other side. Then I fell into the chasm." Explaining the meaning of this simple dream to her fellow prisoner, Skoll said, "The child is our idea, and it will prevail despite all obstacles. We can prepare the way for it, even though we will have to die for it before its victory." We can think of examples of that, even very recently, but that sense is so powerful about our need to resist and to hold on to truth. And what I hold on to when I tell Charlotte's story is this message of courage and resistance. Her writing and the film that I'm in the midst of making, that I'm actually determined that I need to get made by 2028, by the next US elections, is this idea of needing to protest, and of our need to find a way to share our real and imagined stories and our truths. Just a few weeks ago, a friend sent me a dream that he'd had on a WhatsApp. He's a kind of new friend and he lives in New York. He said, "Just thinking about your work, I literally just woke from a full panic nightmare. In the dream, I was clutching my dog, running upstairs, trying to wake my children to say goodbye one last time, as armed agents were storming my house and about to hog-tie me in front of them. The agents were ICE. He says, "The only way I have found not to be infected is by art, creating, disseminating, and experiencing it. For example, your work helped frame my dream. Instead of being terrified by it, I was almost in awe. Like, wow, this is what Amanda's been talking about. It's in my unconscious now." He says, "At a global level, I have no idea, but at a personal level, being able to see the larger forces at work is so helpful." Just today, I came across a kind of a sort of obituary, a program that was broadcast, written again by Roland Wittgenstein. Um, and it's a sort of 5 pages of text that described her life. And at the end, he says, "On the 15th of May, 1986, Charlotte died in a New York hospital. She was 85. For me and for many of her friends, it remains difficult to imagine that she's gone." I get almost emotional talking about Charlotte, and I'm wearing her ring that was given to me in a story I might maybe get a chance to tell you. But It's difficult to imagine she's gone. Integrity, intellectual courage, generosity, loyalty towards friend and adversary alike were qualities we learned from her. She was a demanding yet deeply humane teacher without equal. An American saying holds that heroes do not die, they slowly fade away. May that fading endure a long while still. We remember her, and her books bear witness, a woman of great heart and clear mind, whose love of humanity was never sentimental. That was broadcast in 1987, and I'm so grateful that people are interested in her story and that I can carry on this legacy, and that she hasn't really faded away. She did for a while, but she's back, I hope. And I hope so with this film. If anybody's interested in helping me to make the film, if anybody knows anyone who would like to help fund the film, we're quite advanced. We've had lots of really amazing support. I'm just about to sort of get into some scripts, and but we'll need to be able to fund it. So thank you so much, Isabel, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Well, thank you so much for that incredible presentation. We already have quite a few questions from the audience, so I'll just jump right in. But just a reminder to our audience that while we're talking, you can still submit questions. So if you feel inspired to do so, while I'm asking the questions, feel free to put them in the Zoom Q&A. Um, but I'll get started with one of the more general questions that was asked. You mentioned that before this new translation, the book had been out of print for quite some time, and so it had sort of faded a bit into obscurity. We have someone who's wondering if you know what the modern reaction has been like to this new translation, and what people have had to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, I was really overwhelmed at nearly all the broadsheets in America. And
Mhm.
so it's been in print in other languages. It's just English that it fell out of print. And maybe that's why her whole story did, because I guess English is, that important language that can keep things, in the light. But all the broadsheets, nearly all of them in America and here, besides The Guardian, carried
Mhm.
very, I thought, really meaningfully. So, since last April, and some of them obviously got it before, Zadie Smith wrote a whole piece, and it's included in essays she also wrote. So she surprised us by writing a big article in the New York Review of Books, like way early in the week that President Trump was elected, was your election in November. She sort of said to us, I'm really sorry. You're going to be cross with me, but I've just written an article and it's coming out tomorrow." That was November. That was nearly 6 months before we were publishing. We were like, well, you can never be cross with Zadie Smith, because if she publishes something, it's brilliant. But it's been really overwhelmingly, I think there's been huge interest, and as politics have unfolded more and more, the sense of the importance of this has grown.
Thank you for sharing. Um, we have now another more specific question about the people whose dreams were collected. You mentioned, often there were a lot of feelings of shame and anxiety around these dreams. One of our viewers is wondering if people were sort of made anxious by the fact that they were having such unusual dreams, and if that caused them to sort of hide the fact that they were having such vivid dreams, or if it went the other way and people were really open about having these unusual experiences with their dreams.
Um, I don't think she goes into, I mean, that sometimes she reflects on the conversation that happened,
Mhm.
when people are sort of saying, I think I had this dream because just
Mm.
yesterday the tailor's son turned up to ask that I pay the bill.
Mm,
and that's never happened. And he was wearing SS uniform. And when I
mm,
asked him, why are you wearing your SS uniform? So what you're seeing is this sort of breaking of human bonds quite a lot,
mhm,
and people often reflecting on that, on questioning why they're dreaming like that. Yes, definitely
mhm,
questioning and trying to put it together and trying to make sense of it. Um, Definitely that. I was told something recently about that some people were reluctant to have anesthetics
mm,
in case they talked in their sleep in public. And so I think the anxiety was how much, this idea of mind control, of people actually being able to read your dreams and your thoughts. So it's sort of in the 30s, before any of this sort of technology, before we had Alexa and our phones and all these kinds of things, mass surveillance, the fear of it. And because people were fearful, they self-censored, and that
mm.
self-censoring was a great tool for that regime. So
Well, thank you for sharing. We have another question about the specific people whose dreams were shared. Um, you mentioned at the beginning that she spoke to people who were both Jewish and not Jewish. But we have someone who's wondering if when she was introducing the dreams in her book, if she mentioned whether the dreamer was Jewish or not, or if that was left out.
a fair bit. I think where it's relevant, yes. So
Hmm.
like one of the dreams, where she says that this person was half Jewish.
Hmm.
Um, there's a whole chapter devoted to Jewish dreams, and they're
Hmm.
in a category of their own. And the others, she either doesn't say, or is she just sort of, you've got that sense of that sort of inner capitulation, the way in which people were kind of collapsing in the inside. But there's definitely this sort of sense of the othering
Hmm.
of people, and whether to be part of the chorus or to be, can you stand outside of it. But yeah, so you sort of, at times you just, it's more generic, and at times you know the person. But what's interesting is all the people she would have asked would have been people who were not avid supporters of the regime. Um, they were all struggling. People began to struggle with,
Hmm.
which we can see in populations as well. And
Hmm.
we understand, it helps to understand how people ended up doing what they did, how Germans
Hmm.
ended up doing what they did, because that's in a struggle. Was so sort of fierce.
Thank you. We have another sort of related question. Um, Someone is wondering if you know how important Berat's Jewish identity was to her and if she was at all observant or religious.
She was not really.
Hmm.
She talks very little of it, and she says, really, like many educated liberal Jews in Germany, I've learned through this work. She felt really assimilated. That she
Hmm.
felt German before she felt Jewish in a way.
Hmm.
She said they felt very, very assimilated. And it was not, she says, until Kristallnacht that Hitler made me believe that I was Jewish, and and I knew I had to leave. So her identity was not, and she was aware of it. And even when she got to New York, I mean, it was not, those were not the people she sought out particularly,
Hmm.
but it sort of framed what she then understood. There was no escaping it at that point.
Hmm. Thank you. We have another question sort of going back to the content of the dreams. You mentioned how a lot of these fears, sort of about mass surveillance, were a bit ahead of her time because it was so early on, and how it was, before the concept of Orwell's Big Brother. Um, Someone is asking if any of these authors, like George Orwell, were aware of her work, if you know if they were influenced at all by it, or if it was sort of mere coincidence, the similarities.
No, I don't think, because she only she wrote one article in 1943. So she got to New York and she wrote one article, which is called for Free World magazine, which
Hmm.
you can see, you can find online, and it's a sort of like a sort of an article mini version of this book. Um, but no, I think the dreams just remained in a box somewhere with
Mm.
papers, and she was busy dyeing hair and just surviving. Her husband had gone blind. He died in
Mm.
1949, and those 20 years are give you a real sense. I've been in the archives in Marbach where there's sort of 15 boxes of her material that no one's ever really been through. A couple of authors have, but not really, and been sifting through it. I just sort of really was struck by how hard those, and many of the families, maybe people here on this will know those years after the war of trying to rebuild a life. So no,
Mm.
she didn't write, and I don't know that anyone. She's like this kind of corner of history. It was sort of
Mhm.
slightly forgotten. I don't know if it was because she's a woman, because she was kind of modest. There was a lot of writing about it in the 60s, and yet it just didn't really sort of land more deeply than that somehow.
Well, thank you for sharing. We have actually a couple people have written in and asked if you'd be willing to share the story of the ring that you mentioned
Yeah.
earlier.
I know that. So for all my attempts to give you all this sort of really academic stuff, everyone was like, yeah, tell us about the ring. Tell us about the
Mhm.
ring. So this ring is Charlotte's ring. And it came about that I was in San Francisco. I had
Mhm.
a residency at the Jewish Film Institute there in 24, which was fabulous. A whole year of residency via Zoom, and then we had 2 weeks there. And just before the residency was about to start, I'd had a sort of rough day with just sort of work related, film related stuff, and I was feeling quite exhausted already. Three and
Mhm.
a half years I've been working on this project, and I was like, oh God, I don't, am I gonna, maybe it's just too much. Maybe I can't do this.
Mhm.
And I went to sleep that night. I looked up the rafters and I said, Charlotte, if you're up there, send me a sign that I should carry on. And the next morning, I got a call, like literally as I woke up, the phone rang in London, and my friend said, we just got a BBC Radio 4 commission for a documentary we put in for. So that was great. That felt like a sign. Then I jumped in a taxi and I went down to Stamford, and there I met uh, a couple who were friends of Charlotte, who some of the only living friends of Charlotte, and had Gerhard and Regina Kasper, who've been very helpful to me. Um, and but I hadn't had the opportunity to meet them. It was over Zoom. We'd had many Zooms. And Gerhard had been Dean of Stanford, I think. They were really, really welcoming and hospitable, and we talked a lot about Charlotte. And then as I was leaving, Regina said, I've got something to show you. And I said, okay. And she couldn't find it. She was running around the house looking for it, and the taxi was waiting. I said, send me a picture. No, no, I want to show you. I want to show you. And then she pulled out this box and she opened it and she pulled out the ring and she said,
Mhm.
here, I want you to have this. Charlotte would want you to have it. And I was like, wow, okay. And I was in the taxi going back to San Francisco, and I thought, geez, I think that's a sign. So here I am. So I wear it, and I don't know, it feels like she's in the room. She's in the room with us.
Well, thank you so much for indulging us and sharing that wonderful story. I'll now take it back to some more academic questions. We have one more. Someone is asking, Beradt was not specifically, Freudian in her strain of thought. Do you know why she decided to record dreams specifically instead of looking at it from a different angle?
I think she was probably just in the moment. I mean, she did this journalist, and she was. Oh, I found all her articles, not hundreds, but tens and tens and tens of articles from the 1930s that she
Mhm,
cut out and kept, and they were about all kinds of things to do with German life, and they were like these little portraits of Berlin in the 19
mhm,
late 20s and 30s, early 30s, and in some ways, these are like other little sketch, like also like portraits, but they're kind of
mhm,
like portraits of an inner life. And I think that maybe that's just how she saw it. She was sort of documenting
mhm,
something. If you call as well, I mean, the surrealists were using dreams a lot. The
mhm,
expressionists, cinema, her first husband was a film critic for a big newspaper. And so they would have known about dream collect. She would have known about how it sort of was informing and sort of suffusing cultural and artistic life. So
mhm,
I suppose she just thought it was material that
mhm,
maybe she would use at some point, and she did. And you know, nearly 100 years later, here it is. And what's extraordinary is obviously none of these dreamers are alive. We don't know what happened to most of them. We don't know if any survived, but their
mhm,
dreams live on, and they're a really important bit of history.
mhm. Thank you so much. Well, we do have plenty more questions, so thank you to our audience for being so engaged. We do unfortunately just have a few minutes left, so I think this will be our last question. But it was asked by quite a few people, and I think it's a nice one to end on. We have a few people who are wondering, you mentioned the radio documentary and the film that you're working on. We have some people who are wondering where they can keep up with news and updates about it and where they can go if they'd like to support them as well.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. Well, the radio documentary for those in the UK, you can get it on BBC Sounds, and it's called Dreaming the Third Reich, and it's we broadcast it just around Holocaust Memorial Week. Um, so um, and if you can't, I can sort of share it with you. If anybody wants to get in touch, you can look on my website, which is amandarubin.com, and there's a page on the Third Reich Dreams, and you'll find, and also my contact. So if you want to email me, you're welcome to, and I can sort of selectively share the radio doc with you outside, because I just figure if the BBC is not going to share it, then I am. Um, and I shouldn't really go out, but I think it's fine. I think that'll be fine. And then also, if you have any kind of interest or know people who might be interested in helping to support the film as well, I have a really brilliant team. I can also share a sort of teaser trailer with you, and would love to hear if anybody sort of wants to get involved somehow. So thank you though
Thank-
for that interest.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing that information with all of us. Um, And just one more time before we leave, I would like to thank you, Amanda, so much for coming and giving us this wonderful presentation. And of course, I would like to thank our audience as well. If you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support and joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events. So thank you all again so much for joining us and wishing you a wonderful day, and we hope to see everyone soon. Thank you.